I've attended the Ashmore Manor winter reception for 11 years running. It's the sort of evening that looks well from the outside: candlelight in the great hall, a string quartet in the corridor, local worthies in their good coats nodding over warm wine, and is mildly dull from the inside. Gerald Ashmore raises money for the Parish Restoration Fund, and he raises it efficiently, and the price we pay is 2 hours on a cold stone floor admiring the family portraits. I am a retired antiques dealer. I know how to look at an old painting without actually seeing it. I tell you this so you understand the kind of evening it was when Bernard Oakes sat down at the Steinway. I didn't know his name then. I learned it afterward, from his neighbor, a woman named Iris Cattell, who was also at the reception and who told me what she knew, quietly, in the car park, while we were still finding our breath. At the time I knew him only as the postman. Our village postman. I'd seen him on his rounds for years, a lean, unhurried man in his late 60s, with a red post bag worn soft at the strap and the particular quality of self-containment that belongs to people who spend their mornings alone on country lanes. I don't think I'd ever spoken to him beyond good morning. He was standing near the piano when Ashmore spotted him. The Steinway is the one extravagance in the Great Hall, a black concert grand Gerald Ashmore inherited from his mother and polishes weekly, by all accounts, though no one ever plays it. It sits in the corner like a very large closed book. I had never heard it played in 11 years of winter receptions. Bernard was standing beside it with a glass of wine he hadn't touched, one hand resting very lightly on the fallboard, the way you might rest a hand on a fence post at the edge of a field, not pressing, just touching. Ashmore saw him from across the room. I couldn't hear what was said first, some murmur, something that made the 2 or 3 people nearest to them turn around. Then Ashmore spoke louder, with the expansive good humor of a man who is used to being heard. "Bernard," he said, and already there was something performative in the use of the name, a pantomime of familiarity. "Since you're so drawn to it, why not give us something festive? Nothing too ambitious. Just something to fill the silence." A few people laughed. Not unkindly. The way you laugh at a dog that wanders onto a stage, without malice, but with no real expectation of anything. I was at the far end of the hall, but I turned, because Ashmore's voice carries, and because the quality of the laughter told me something was happening. Bernard didn't answer straight away. He looked at the piano for a moment. Then he set his wine glass down on the small table beside the Steinway and pulled out the bench. I think I assumed he would play something halting. A few bars of a carol, perhaps, or the opening of something recognizable taken very slowly, the way amateurs always play, with the right shape but the wrong weight. The cluster of guests nearest the piano angled themselves politely toward him. Ashmore remained where he was, arms folded, wearing the genial expression of a man who has set up a small jest and is waiting to enjoy it. Bernard lifted the fallboard. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. Not nervously, he wasn't fidgeting, wasn't rolling his shoulders, wasn't doing any of the things that people do when they are gathering themselves for an ordeal. He simply sat, very still, the way I have since come to think is simply how he is, a man who does not waste movement. Then he placed his hands on the keys. What came out of that piano in the next breath was not a carol. It was not a warm-up. It was a single line of melody so clean and so grave that the room seemed to hear it as a change in the weather, not alarming, but unmistakable. A shift in temperature. The 2 women beside me stopped mid-sentence. The man to my left turned his head. I did not recognize the piece immediately. I am not a musical man. I know what I like, which is silence, mostly, and bird song, and occasionally a fine organ in a cold church. But I know a serious thing when I hear one, and what I heard coming from the far end of the candlelit hall was utterly serious. Slow. In a minor key that felt less like sadness than like the memory of sadness, like grief that has been lived with long enough that it has become something almost peaceful, something that can be held without flinching. The melody moved through the room the way candlelight moves. It didn't announce itself, it arrived, and you noticed it only once it was already there. By the time I had crossed quietly to a better position, I moved without thinking, the way you move towards something you do not want to be further from. The nearest guests had rearranged themselves without speaking. No one had organized it. People had simply turned, and settled, and the murmur of conversation had stopped in the way that conversation stops when something more important takes its place. Gerald Ashmore had unfolded his arms. His glass hung at his side, not quite forgotten, not quite held. Bernard played with his eyes closed. Not closed in concentration, or in the self-conscious manner of a performer reaching for effect. Closed the way you close your eyes when you are listening to something that belongs to you and to no one else. His posture at the bench was unremarkable, not trained, not stiff, but settled, the way a man is settled who has sat in the same chair for many years, alone in a room no one else enters. His hands were large and weathered, the hands of a man who has worked outdoors in all conditions, and they moved over the keys with a slowness and a sureness that had nothing in it of hesitation. The melody gathered. I say gathered because that is how it felt, not rising, not swelling, but collecting itself, the way water collects in a low place. The left hand moved beneath the right in a quiet, rocking figure, regular as breathing, and over it the right hand carried the long, unhurried melody with a tenderness that I can only describe by saying it did not feel performed. It felt private. It felt as though we were overhearing something that was not meant for us. I found, at some point, that my throat had tightened. A woman 3 places to my left had raised a hand to her face. I noticed it without looking directly at her, in the peripheral, particular way you notice the quiet things in a quiet room. The man beside her had not moved but was absolutely still, the falsies gone from his shoulders. Near the fireplace, 2 of the older guests had turned to face the piano fully, and one of them had set her glass down on the mantelpiece without looking at it, the way you put something down when your hands are suddenly needed for something else, even if that something else is only holding yourself. Ashmore stood where he had stood throughout. I glanced at him once. His expression had changed in a way I found difficult to name. The geniality was gone, not replaced by discomfort, or embarrassment, or any of the ordinary human responses to being caught out in a small cruelty. What was there instead was something simpler. He was simply listening. He had forgotten, for the moment, that he had said anything at all. Bernard played for perhaps 7 or 8 minutes. I lost track. Time in that hall had shifted to the rhythm of the music, and the music was in no hurry. The pavane, I learned later that was what it was, a 4 pavane, written for orchestra and here arranged for solo piano, does not resolve into triumph. It does not give you a standing ovation moment, a dramatic close, a final chord that tells you to applaud. It ends as it begins, quietly, slowly, the melody returning one last time and then releasing, the final note so soft that the silence afterward was not an absence of sound but its completion. Bernard held his hands above the keys for a moment after the last note. Not theatrically. Just long enough for the sound to fully leave the room. Then he lowered the fallboard, gently, over the keys. No one spoke. I am not sure anyone breathed. The candles on the hall table were the only things moving, small, domestic flames that had no idea what had just happened in the room around them. It was the young woman nearest the piano who cried first, openly. A single sharp breath in, and then she was not trying to stop it, and why would she? The woman with her hand at her face gave in entirely and made no attempt to hide it. Across the room, the older man by the fireplace pressed his lips together with the particular expression of a man of a certain age and disposition who has been surprised into feeling something and is choosing not to be ashamed of it. He did not manage to look entirely unmoved. I don't think any of us did. I was not unmoved. I am 67 years old, and I have been to a great many evenings in a great many rooms, and I am not generally a man who weeps at music. I wept at that music. I turned away slightly, toward the wall, which is the thing we do when we're not prepared for what we are feeling, and I looked at nothing for a moment, and I let it pass. When I turned back, Bernard had stood up from the bench. He wasn't taking a bow, he didn't seem to understand that was what the moment called for, or perhaps he understood it perfectly and had decided it wasn't what he was there for. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his wine glass. He held it in both hands and looked at the floor. The applause came then, not sudden, not a burst, but the way rain comes after a long dry spell, 1 person, and then 2, and then all of us, and it kept going longer than anyone intended. People clapped with their eyes still wet. The young woman nearest the piano clapped and made no attempt to stop crying. Bernard looked up and gave a short nod, once, measured, and then looked at the floor again. Gerald Ashmore had not moved from where he stood. When the applause eased, I looked at him. He had set his wine glass down on the tray of a passing server, carefully, without looking at it, and he did not applaud. I don't say that critically. I think he was full up. I think the applause was not, at that moment, something he had the architecture for. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Bernard Oakes with an expression that contained no remnant of his earlier performative bonhomie. There was nothing in his face now but attention. And, I thought, a quietness that had not been there before. He did not say anything to Bernard that I saw. Not that evening. It was Iris Cattell who found me in the car park as people were leaving, tucking scarves against the December cold and retrieving car keys. I had spoken with her perhaps twice before. She lives in the lane behind the village post office, and she came to stand beside me with the look of someone carrying something they need to set down with another person. She told me about Bernard's route. 42 years of the same round, the same lanes, the same houses. She told me about the woman at the end of Pear Tree Lane, a widow named Eleanor Marsh, who had lived alone in the cottage there for as long as anyone could remember, and about how Bernard had delivered her post every morning for 40 years. How on mornings when the post was thin or absent he would sometimes stand at the gate a moment longer than needed. How Eleanor would sometimes hum, at no one in particular, at the morning, at the garden, and one of the things she hummed, Iris said, Bernard would hear through the letterbox as he posted the morning letters, rising and falling in the kitchen beyond. The pavane. She had hummed it for years. She didn't know Bernard knew the name for it. She may not have known, Iris thought, that he had learned to play it. He had an old upright in the back room of his house, she said, the keys yellowed and 3 of them slightly off. She'd heard it herself, some evenings, through the garden wall. She'd never asked him about it. Eleanor Marsh died in April. She said it matter-of-factly, because facts are what they were and sentiment doesn't change them. Bernard had never told Eleanor anything. In 40 years of morning deliveries, Iris said, and she said it without judgment, only with the particular sorrow of knowing a thing you cannot fix, he had not once said what he might have said. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I have thought, in the weeks since, about the word for what Bernard Oakes played that evening in Ashmore's Great Hall. I know it technically now, a pavane, written by a Frenchman in the 19th century, scored for orchestra and here played alone on an inherited Steinway by a retired postman in his good jacket. But the technical word is not the word that matters. The word that matters is that Bernard played the piece he had taught himself, in a back room, on a failing upright, not for an audience and not for applause, but because she had hummed it through a letterbox for 40 years and he had loved her without ever finding a way to say so, and the music was the only language in which that truth had somewhere to go. Gerald Ashmore raised more money than usual for the parish fund that winter. I don't know if the two things are connected. I suspect they are. What I know is that I will not easily attend another evening in that hall without hearing, under whatever noise the room contains, the quiet of 7 minutes in December when a postman told the truth about his whole life, and every person present understood exactly what he meant, and none of us had a word for it either.